The city was alive, yet there was a strange hollowness to it. The streets were lined with neon signs blinking out half-hearted promises of food, entertainment, and escape. Cold winds swept through the alleys, scattering yesterday's news and cigarette butts. It was late evening, and the sidewalks were crowded with people heading somewhere, or nowhere at all. The distant hum of cars and the occasional honk provided a backdrop to the ambient murmur of voices. Among the crowd, a man shuffled along the edge of the sidewalk, a little slower than everyone else, as though the weight of the world was pressing on his back. His name was Thomas, though no one cared to ask anymore. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, the faded jacket doing little to shield him from the cold. His scruffy beard and weathered face told a story of years spent surviving rather than living. A tattered duffel bag was slung over his shoulder, containing all his worldly possessions. A couple of threadbare shirts, a book missing its cover, and a pair of mismatched socks. Thomas had long stopped thinking of himself as anything more than part of the scenery. He paused outside a convenience store, staring at the glowing sign advertising coffee for $1. His breath fogged the glass as he imagined the warmth of the drink in his hands. He patted his pockets, knowing full well there was nothing to find. A dull pang of hunger gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. It wasn't the worst he'd felt, not by a long shot. Thomas stepped back, blending into the shadows near the entrance as hurried customers brushed past him, some clutching hot cups of coffee. No one met his eyes. They never did. He didn't blame them. He wouldn't want to see himself either. As the crowd thinned, he spotted a man walking toward the store. Even in the dim light, the figure stood out. He moved with an ease and confidence that came from a life of knowing he belonged. Thomas recognized him immediately. Clint Eastwood. There was no mistaking the tall frame, the sharp eyes, the way he carried himself like the world owed him nothing and he owed it nothing in return. Dressed in a casual leather jacket and jeans, Clint looked like someone who could have walked off the set of one of his movies. Thomas hesitated. Asking for help wasn't something he liked doing, but desperation had a way of forcing his hand. As Clint approached the door, Thomas stepped forward, his voice dry and cracked from disuse. "Excuse me, sir. Could you spare $1? Just enough for a coffee." Clint stopped and looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. It wasn't a look of disdain, but one of calculation, as if he were sizing Thomas up. The pause stretched, and for a moment, Thomas wished he hadn't asked. He opened his mouth to apologize, to say it didn't matter, but Clint spoke first. "Dollar for coffee, huh?" Clint's voice was calm, measured, with that familiar edge that could cut through silence like a knife. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and handed over a 5. "Get yourself something to eat, too." Thomas blinked, stunned. "Thank you," he stammered. "Really, thank you." Clint gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself." With that, he pushed open the door and disappeared inside, leaving Thomas clutching the bill like it was a lifeline. For a moment, Thomas stood there, torn between disbelief and gratitude. He stepped into the store, the warmth enveloping him like a long-forgotten hug. He ordered a coffee and a sandwich, savoring every bite and sip as if it were the finest meal he'd ever had. It wasn't just the food that warmed him. It was the kindness of a stranger, a man who could have ignored him but didn't. As he stepped back into the cold, he felt lighter, as though the world had shifted ever so slightly in his favor. But the night wasn't done surprising him. A sleek black Tesla rolled to a stop at the curb, the hum of its electric motor barely audible. The window rolled down, and Thomas caught sight of another familiar face. Elon Musk, dressed in a sharp blazer and a t-shirt. He leaned slightly out of the car, his eyes sharp with curiosity and amusement. "Hey," Musk called out. "I saw what happened back there. Care to tell me about it?" Thomas froze, unsure how to respond. What could he possibly say to one of the world's richest men? He hesitated, but Musk didn't seem to mind. Instead, he gestured toward the passenger seat. "Hop in. Let's talk." Thomas glanced around, half expecting someone to tell him this was a joke. But no one came, and the invitation hung in the air. Tentatively, he opened the door and slid into the seat, the warmth of the car a stark contrast to the chill outside. As the Tesla pulled away from the curb, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his night, and perhaps his life, was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. The warmth of the Tesla felt unreal to Thomas, like he'd stepped into a different world entirely. The hum of the car's engine was almost imperceptible, and the dashboard glowed with futuristic screens displaying maps, battery percentages, and data Thomas couldn't begin to comprehend. Elon Musk sat beside him, radiating an energy that felt both curious and commanding. For a man with the world at his fingertips, he seemed surprisingly grounded, yet his gaze carried the weight of someone constantly thinking 5 steps ahead. "So," Elon began, his tone casual but probing, "you asked Clint Eastwood for $1. Got 5 instead. Why him?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "I didn't pick him," he admitted. "I didn't even realize it was him at first. I needed something, and he happened to be there." Elon nodded, tapping a finger on the steering wheel. "Fate, then. Or luck. Funny how those things work, isn't it?" He paused, glancing at Thomas. "What's your story?" Thomas hesitated. It wasn't a story he told often, and even when he did, people rarely stuck around long enough to hear it. But something about the moment, the surrealness of sitting next to one of the richest men alive, pushed him to speak. "I had a life once," Thomas began, his voice low. "A job, a house, a family. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Then the layoffs started. I worked construction, good work, steady pay. But when the economy tanked, so did the jobs. Bills piled up. My wife, she couldn't take it. She left, took the kids. The house went next. And here I am." Elon listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. "You know," Elon said finally, "most people would look at you and think you're just another statistic, a casualty of the system. But I don't believe in lost causes." He turned toward Thomas, his eyes gleaming with something akin to excitement. "What if I told you there's a way out?" Thomas blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "A way out?" Elon smiled, a faint but knowing curve of his lips. "I like solving problems, Thomas. Big ones, small ones. Doesn't matter. And I think you're an interesting problem. What if we changed your story? Gave you a second chance?" Thomas's heart raced. The idea sounded absurd, like something out of a movie. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's start simple," Elon said, pulling the car into the parking lot of a sleek, modern building. The sign outside read Neuralink in bold, minimalist letters. "I want to know what drives you. What would you do if you had nothing holding you back? No limits, no constraints." Thomas stared at the building, his mind reeling. "I don't even know anymore," he admitted. "Surviving is the only thing I think about." Elon's smile widened. "Then let's fix that." They stepped out of the car, the brisk night air biting at Thomas's skin again. Inside, the building was a stark contrast, bright, clean, and filled with people who moved with purpose. Elon led him through hallways lined with glass walls, past labs filled with glowing equipment and scientists engrossed in their work. The hum of activity was almost overwhelming. "You see," Elon began as they walked, "people are stuck in cycles, poverty, failure, addiction, you name it. But what if we could rewrite those cycles? Change how the brain processes fear, doubt, even trauma?" Neuralink isn't just about technology. It's about unlocking potential. Thomas frowned. "You're talking about, what? Brain surgery?" "Not surgery," Elon corrected, stopping to face him. "Enhancement. Think of it as giving you the tools you never had. The ability to focus, to adapt, to rebuild. You could have everything you lost, and more." The offer hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Thomas felt torn. Part of him wanted to run, to reject the idea as some billionaire's experiment. But another part, a desperate, hungry part, wondered if this was his chance to claw his way back. "What's the catch?" he asked finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "No catch," Elon replied smoothly. "Only choice. This isn't something I'll force on you. But I think you've got potential, Thomas. And I think you know it too." The room around them seemed to hum with anticipation. Thomas looked at Elon, searching his face for any hint of manipulation or deceit. But Elon's expression remained open, almost disarmingly sincere. "All right," Thomas said, the word escaping before he could overthink it. I'll do it. The decision set off a chain reaction. Within minutes, Thomas found himself in a sleek lab, surrounded by scientists explaining the procedure in terms he barely understood. Wires, monitors, and glowing interfaces filled the room, their presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. A young woman in a lab coat smiled reassuringly as she prepared him for the next step. As the device, a small, delicate implant, was placed gently on the back of his head, Thomas felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The room blurred for a moment, and then clarity. A flood of sensations and thoughts overwhelmed him, sharper and more vivid than ever before. It was as if a fog he hadn't realized he'd been living in had lifted. When he opened his eyes, Elon was watching him closely. "How do you feel?" he asked. Thomas struggled for words. "Different. Like, everything makes sense." Elon's grin was triumphant. "Good. Now, let's see what you can do." Over the next few weeks, Thomas's life transformed. The implant heightened his focus, unlocking abilities he never thought possible. He found himself analyzing situations with razor-sharp precision, solving problems effortlessly, and even recalling memories he'd long buried. But with each step forward, the pressure mounted. Elon's expectations grew, and the media caught wind of the mysterious homeless man who'd become a project of the world's most powerful innovator. Not everyone was pleased. Critics called the experiment unethical, a dangerous gamble with human lives. Activists accused Elon of exploiting the vulnerable for his own gain. And Thomas? He found himself caught in the middle, torn between gratitude and a growing sense of unease. The more he achieved, the more distant he felt from the man he'd been. Was this new life truly his, or just a carefully crafted illusion? The lines between choice and control blurred, and Thomas began to question whether he'd traded one kind of prison for another. The night was unusually still, the city holding its breath as if it, too, sensed something was about to snap. Thomas stood in the middle of the Neuralink headquarters main lab, his reflection distorted in the polished steel of the machines surrounding him. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. Elon stood across from him, his usual calm replaced by a crackling energy. Around them, technicians watched with uneasy expressions, their fingers hovering over keyboards, waiting for instructions. "You've come so far, Thomas," Elon said, his voice low but filled with something more than admiration, expectation. "But this next step is critical. I need you to prove it." Thomas felt the implant hum faintly at the base of his skull, a constant reminder of the transformation that had consumed him. His mind was sharper, his reflexes quicker, and his confidence unshakable, but at what cost? Over the past weeks, the once small acts of enhancement had turned into something bigger, something darker. He was no longer just a test subject. He was the centerpiece of Elon's grand vision, a vision that seemed to grow more dangerous with every passing day. "What exactly do you mean by prove it?" Thomas asked, his voice steady, though his chest tightened with unease. Elon's eyes glimmered. "I need you to show the world what's possible. We've been keeping this quiet for too long. It's time to go public, to demonstrate the power of Neuralink in real-world scenarios." Thomas frowned. "What kind of scenarios?" Elon turned to a monitor, tapping it to reveal a live feed of a crowded city square. Hundreds of people milled about, unaware they were being observed. "I want you to blend in, assess threats, prevent them, show them what human potential looks like when it's unhindered by fear or hesitation." Thomas's stomach churned. "You want me to spy on people?" "Not spy," Elon corrected, his voice cool. "Protect, guide, show them what it means to be better." The words felt hollow, twisted to sound noble but hiding something insidious. Thomas clenched his fists. "This isn't what I signed up for." Elon's gaze hardened, the warmth draining from his face. "You didn't sign up for anything, Thomas. You chose this path when you asked for help. Now you're part of something bigger. Don't forget that." The weight of the statement hung heavy in the air. Thomas looked around at the technicians, their faces a mixture of fear and silent agreement. They wouldn't challenge Elon. Not here, not now. But Thomas wasn't sure he could follow this path any longer. "I'm not your tool," Thomas said, his voice rising. "I didn't ask to be turned into some experiment for your vision of the future." Elon stepped closer, his tone icy. You think you'd be better off without this? Back on the streets, begging for coffee money? I gave you a second chance, Thomas. Don't throw it away. The room buzzed with tension. The hum of the machines and the faint whir of the air conditioning the only sounds as the two men stared each other down. Thomas's mind raced, his enhanced brain processing every possible outcome. He could feel the implant's influence, urging him to act, to strategize. But the question loomed. Whose voice was he listening to, his own or Elon's? Suddenly, a blaring alarm shattered the silence. Red lights bathed the room as a robotic voice announced, "Unauthorized access detected. Security breach in progress." Elon spun toward the nearest technician. "What's happening?" The young woman's hands flew across the keyboard, her face pale. "Someone's trying to hack into the system. They're targeting the Neuralink database." Thomas's heart pounded. The breach was a lifeline, a chance to break free. But it also meant danger, for everyone in the building and potentially beyond. "Shut it down," Elon ordered. "Lock out all external connections." The technician hesitated. "If we shut it down now, we could lose." "Do it," Elon snapped, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. Thomas's implant surged with data, the breach feeding into his heightened senses. He could feel the threads of the attack, the way the system's defenses were crumbling. He realized with startling clarity that whoever was behind this knew exactly where to strike. "Elon," Thomas said, his voice urgent, "this isn't just a random hack. Someone knows what you're doing here." Elon's jaw tightened. "Then we stop them." But Thomas wasn't so sure. His mind flooded with questions. Who was behind this? And more importantly, why? Was this an attack on Elon, or a rescue attempt for him? Before he could think further, the screens around the room flickered. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "Neuralink isn't the future, it's a weapon, and we won't let you unleash it." The message sent a chill down Thomas's spine. He glanced at Elon, whose expression had turned to stone. "They don't understand," Elon muttered, almost to himself. "They can't see the bigger picture." But Thomas wasn't so sure anymore. The doubts he'd been suppressing rose to the surface, louder than ever. Was this really about progress, or had he been a pawn in Elon's game all along? The room erupted into chaos as the breach escalated. Monitors displayed cascading lines of code, and technicians shouted over one another in a desperate attempt to regain control. Thomas felt his implant pulse, the overwhelming data pushing him toward a decision he wasn't ready to make. "Elon," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "you need to stop this. Shut it all down. Walk away before it's too late." Elon turned to him, his eyes blazing. "You don't understand what's at stake, Thomas. This isn't about you or me. It's about humanity. If we stop now, we let fear win. Is that what you want?" Thomas stared at him, his heart pounding. The room felt like it was closing in, the weight of the moment threatening to crush him. He thought of everything he'd gained and everything he'd lost. Could he trust Elon to wield this power responsibly? Or was it up to him to stop it? The decision came in a flash, instinct overriding hesitation. Thomas reached for the nearest console, his fingers moving with a speed and precision he hadn't known before the implant. The system responded to him, recognizing him as part of its network. He could feel the code bending to his will. "What are you doing?" Elon shouted, rushing toward him. Thomas didn't answer. His hands flew across the keyboard, navigating layers of security and protocols. The implant guided him, amplifying his abilities, but the choice was his. With a final keystroke, he initiated a full shutdown. The lights flickered, and the hum of the machines died. The room plunged into silence, save for the heavy breathing of everyone inside. Elon stared at him, fury and disbelief etched into his face. "Do you realize what you've done?" Thomas met his gaze, his voice steady. "I stopped you from crossing a line you can't come back from." Elon opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, the distorted voice returned over the speakers. "Good choice, Thomas. You've just saved a lot of people." The connection cut out, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt like himself again. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The silence in the lab was suffocating. The once vibrant hum of Neuralink's machinery was gone, replaced by the weight of what had just occurred. Technicians stood frozen, their eyes darting between the darkened screens and the two men at the center of the room. Elon Musk's face was a storm of emotions: anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something close to betrayal. Thomas, on the other hand, felt an eerie calm, as if the chaos of the last few hours had drained every ounce of fear from him. "You had no right," Elon finally said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "Do you have any idea what you've cost us? What you've cost humanity?" Thomas met his gaze, unflinching. "I know exactly what I've done, and I'm not sorry." Elon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might say something more. But instead, he turned and walked toward the door, signaling for the technicians to follow. One by one, they filed out, leaving Thomas alone in the dimly lit room. He sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands, the weight of his decision finally settling on his shoulders. In the days that followed, the world's reaction was swift and polarizing. News of the Neuralink breach spread like wildfire, and the leaked footage of Thomas shutting down the system only added fuel to the fire. Some hailed him as a hero, a man brave enough to stand against unchecked technological power. Others painted him as a saboteur, a fool who had derailed progress for his own misguided reasons. Social media was ablaze with debates, the headlines relentless. Elon Musk's Neuralink, visionary tech or dangerous gamble? Homeless man turned whistleblower, Thomas McGill's shocking story. Neuralink breach sparks global ethical debate. For Thomas, the sudden attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside the shelter where he'd been staying, shouting questions whenever he ventured outside. Offers for interviews flooded in, but he turned them all down. He didn't want fame or notoriety. He just wanted to feel like himself again. But that seemed impossible now. Elon, on the other hand, went on the offensive. In interviews and press releases, he doubled down on his vision, framing the shutdown as a temporary setback. "Progress is never easy," he said during a televised interview, "and it's often misunderstood. But we'll continue to push forward because the future demands it." His calm demeanor belied the fury Thomas knew was simmering beneath the surface. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Neuralink's board launched an internal investigation, and regulators began scrutinizing the company's practices more closely. There were rumors of lawsuits and criminal charges, though nothing concrete had been filed. Yet, for Thomas, the specter of legal action loomed large. Though he had acted on principle, the question of whether his actions were justified in the eyes of the law was far from clear. Thomas found solace in unlikely places. A group of activists advocating for ethical AI and technological transparency reached out, offering support and resources. Through them, he met people who shared his concerns about the direction Neuralink and technology as a whole was heading. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of community, a purpose beyond mere survival. But the victory was bittersweet. The implant, which had given him extraordinary abilities, had also left its mark in ways he hadn't anticipated. Without the constant connection to Neuralink's system, he experienced bouts of dizziness and disorientation. His mind, once razor-sharp, now felt cluttered and sluggish at times, as though it was struggling to return to its natural state. Doctors warned him that the implant's long-term effects were unknown, and the thought of living as a medical anomaly weighed heavily on him. One evening, as he sat alone in a small park on the edge of the city, Thomas watched the sun dip below the horizon. The quiet was a welcome reprieve from the chaos, but it was also a stark reminder of everything he'd lost and gained. A man approached and sat down beside him. It was Clint Eastwood. "Didn't expect to see you here," Clint said, his voice as steady and gravelly as ever. Thomas chuckled softly. "Didn't expect to be here." Clint studied him for a moment before speaking. "You did something big. Not many people would have had the guts to stand up to someone like Musk." "I don't know if it was guts," Thomas replied, staring at the horizon. "Maybe just desperation. Or stupidity." "Maybe," Clint said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But it took courage, too. Don't lose sight of that." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the moment settling over them. Finally, Clint stood, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Take care of yourself, kid. You've got a story to tell, whether you like it or not." As Clint walked away, Thomas felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his life had meaning. He wasn't just a homeless man begging for change or a pawn in a billionaire's game. He was Thomas McGill, a man who had faced impossible odds and found a way to stand his ground. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. The world eventually moved on, as it always does. The Neuralink shutdown became one of those fleeting moments in history that sparks a blaze of outrage, debate, and intrigue, only to dim as newer stories captured the public's attention. For Thomas McGill, however, the echoes of that moment would linger forever. The legal fallout was mercifully less severe than Thomas had feared. After weeks of investigation, regulators concluded that while Thomas had acted outside of his authority, his actions exposed significant ethical and security lapses within Neuralink. Rather than pressing charges, the company shifted its focus to damage control. Public trust in Elon Musk's ventures took a hit, but his charisma and relentless optimism were enough to weather the storm. Neuralink resumed operations months later, this time under stricter oversight and with a retooled public image emphasizing ethics and transparency. Thomas, meanwhile, faded from the spotlight as quickly as he had entered it. The media moved on to the next scandal, and the crowds of reporters outside the shelter disappeared. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he had space to breathe, to think. The world had labeled him a whistleblower, a disruptor, even a hero, but none of those titles felt right. He was just a man who had made a choice, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Physically, Thomas continued to grapple with the effects of the Neuralink implant. The initial side effects of dizziness and mental fog persisted, though they gradually lessened as his brain adjusted. He sought out specialists, some funded by the activist organizations that had rallied around him, who helped him understand the unique challenges he faced. The implant was still there, an undeniable part of him, but he learned to live with it, treating it not as a burden but as a reminder of the price of his choices. Emotionally, the journey was harder. The sense of community he'd found among the activists was comforting, but it couldn't erase the deeper scars, memories of the streets, the desperation that had led him to Neuralink, and the friends he had lost along the way. He often found himself returning to that night in the lab, replaying the moment when he decided to pull the plug. Did he regret it? He wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't have done anything else. One day, a letter arrived, handwritten and unexpected. It was from Elon Musk. The tone was surprisingly personal, far removed from the calculated rhetoric of his public persona. "I still think you're wrong," the letter began, "but I respect that you believed in what you did. Not many people have the conviction to act when the stakes are that high." It ended with a simple offer. "If you ever want to talk, or even just to listen, you know where to find me." Thomas folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't ready to respond, but the gesture left him unsettled. It was a reminder that even Elon, with all his wealth and power, was just a man navigating the complex moral landscape of his own creation. The broader impact of the Neuralink incident rippled quietly through society. Governments and organizations around the world began to take a closer look at the ethical implications of emerging technologies. Public discourse around the balance of progress and responsibility gained new urgency, with Thomas's story often cited as a cautionary tale. For some, it was a reminder that humanity's reach should never outpace its grasp. For others, it was proof that even the boldest visions must be tempered by humility. As for Thomas, he found peace in small, unexpected moments. He began volunteering at shelters, offering support to those still living the life he had once known. He spoke at schools and community centers, not as a whistleblower or a hero, but as a man who had seen the best and worst of human ambition. His message was simple: don't let anyone convince you that you're powerless. The choices you make, no matter how small they seem, can ripple out in ways you can't imagine. One crisp autumn evening, Thomas returned to the park where he'd spoken with Clint Eastwood. The bench was empty, and the sunset bathed the world in shades of gold and crimson. He sat quietly, letting the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a fragile but undeniable hope. Life would never be simple, and the questions that haunted him might never have answers. But he had learned something invaluable. Even in the face of overwhelming power and uncertainty, the courage to act, to choose, could shape a different future. And sometimes that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas stood and walked away, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter, his steps a little surer. The world was far from perfect, but it was still worth fighting for.